I'm Megan Gleason.
I'm Dan Boyd.
And this is Rounding Up the Roundhouse.
If you enjoy our podcasts, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal to help us continue to bring you more content like this. You can find this episode and all our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website, abqjournal.com, as well as YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. See the show notes for a discount on a digital subscription. Thank you for supporting the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico's leading local news source.
We had a busy first day of the 60-day legislative session yesterday. Now we're kind of on to day number 2. A lot was happening yesterday. Megan, what were some of the top, your top takeaways from the day?
Yeah, I mean, it was a busy, hectic day, and it was an interesting day because we had so many new faces, right? So I think we all kind of came into the session. We knew crime was going to be a big thing, and obviously that's kind of what dominated the governor's speech, and then the Republicans' response to the governor's speech. So that's a pretty number one priority, it seems like. What about you, Dan?
Yeah, I covered the governor's speech, and I was interested in kind of the tone she took. As we wrote in the story today, I thought it was kind of equal parts, both praising legislators for a lot of the work that's been done over the last 6 years, but also then prodding them to do more, especially on crime issues. So I think she tried to take a somewhat conciliatory approach. There wasn't a lot of criticism or, really cajoling, but clearly, I think she thinks that there's work to be done on the crime issues, and now we're going to start seeing as these bills are introduced and digging into the details of them whether they're both on the same page.
Yeah, and that's the really interesting thing is that we're seeing a lot of her priorities line up with the Republicans. And coming out of this special session where kind of the same thing happened, it's not totally surprising, but we're still seeing some contention from the Republicans on how she's going about addressing the issues because they don't necessarily agree. They agree that crime is an issue, that the CYFD department is an issue, but how exactly they want to go about solving that seems to be determined.
Yeah, and I know we were talking, Megan, that sometimes the roundhouse feels like its own little world, but there was no mention in the governor's speech of President Donald Trump or a lot of federal policies, and it sounded like Republicans in their response didn't necessarily bring up the new federal administration either.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising. I kind of thought it would dominate more of the conversation. Even the protests outside were mostly focused on climate and labors and stuff, and just not a lot about Trump, which is, I mean, his inauguration was the day before the session started. But yeah, even the Republicans in their conference after the governor's State of the State address, they only mentioned him once or twice. They brought him up when they talked about border security measures and kind of just said, yeah, I think the president is going to take care of this.
Yeah, and I thought some of the things the governor talked about were largely expected. The public safety issues. You mentioned CYFD. There were a few new things, a few surprises. A few things that I picked up on were an idea of kind of a personal income tax exemption for foster parents or grandparents raising grandchildren. So we'll kind of have to see the details of those. Also, a few new ideas for state-run insurance programs, a medical malpractice program, and also for a fire insurance program for people who are having a hard time getting homeowners insurance or other type of insurance policies after some of the fires that we've seen in New Mexico. Was there any other kind of surprises for you on opening day?
She brought up the proposing a tax rebate for businesses to use for security measures. And I think she said, until we get this crime epidemic under control, I want to help them pay for security that they need, which I thought was really interesting on the business side of things. And I was also a little surprised that she didn't bring up the Paid Family and Medical Leave Act at all, which her own party is a really big proponent of. The more liberal Democrats have been pushing to get this through, kind of blocked by the Republicans and the more moderate Democrats, but she didn't mention it at all in her speech.
Yeah, and I know in past years she'd had some misgivings about that idea. My understanding that then she'd kind of supported it, but like you mentioned, it might not be a real top priority for her if it didn't even get mentioned during her 50-minute speech yesterday.
Yeah. And, she did talk about the strategic water supply, and I didn't hear a lot of conversations besides her address. Like, Republicans didn't really respond to the idea of a strategic water supply, which a lot of people are still skeptical of, including her own party.
Yeah, and I believe the Legislative Finance Committee budget does not include funding for that initiative, which is the governor also pushed last year. So Not to say that it can't happen during the next 50 some days. But usually when, starting off, if there's no money for initiative, she's going to have to convince legislators that that's worth appropriating money for. And I also thought it was interesting, a lot of these tax rebates or new programs we're talking about, they're possible because of the state's revenue situation, which is largely due to oil and gas. And the governor mentioned that briefly in her speech, but, didn't talk a lot about it. She did talk about some of these climate initiatives and net zero emissions by 2050. But kind of this interesting tightrope that, the governor's walking, and other legislators as well, of kind of utilizing this amazing amount of revenue that we've seen, while also trying to kind of advance the state into some, renewable energy industries and preparing for a day when we don't have oil and gas.
Yeah, and it works on a boom and bust cycle. So obviously we're in the boom right now, but it's not always going to be a boom. And she also brought up on the climate side of things, wanting to have legislators codify net zero emissions by 2050, which is a big goal. And you were watching the speech, right? The Democrats stood up and applauded that. Yeah,
that was one of the proposals that got the most support from Democratic legislators, kind of standing ovation, and then looking on the Republican side of the House, and most of them were sitting, not clapping, and just kind of staring. So that's clearly still a pretty partisan issue, and we'll see, if the support is there to get it over the finish line, as you mentioned, needing some moderate Democrats to be on board with it as well.
Yeah, and that's often one of the points of contention, I think, in the legislature, is that, like you said, we're getting all this money from oil and gas, but are we really thinking the industry, or are we trying to kind of move away from that? But it is a fossil fuel. It's not always going to be there. And so even the state land commissioner said other revenue sources are never going to be one for oil and gas, but you have to start to try to diversify the economy, because it's not always going to be there.
Right. And for people who weren't at the Roundhouse yesterday, I mean, the opening day to me has always kind of felt like the first day of school, seeing a lot of people that other journalists, there's a lot of people crammed into the building. And after not having been there for a while, it's kind of an exciting atmosphere. What did it feel like for you to be back in the Roundhouse and kind of taking in all the opening day, festivities?
Yeah, no, it is a really fun atmosphere. The opening day is just, it kind of feels like everybody is so excited. You've got 60 days ahead of you. It's going to be crazy, but everybody's ready to get into it. And it wasn't just the media. I think it was on the House floor before they opened up the session. Everybody was mingling. All these new faces are finding their seats. And, everybody brings guests, so they're excited to see their family and their colleagues and have all of that stuff going on. And two, the public really attended this session. There was a big line outside of the House gallery to get in and watch the State of the State address, but a lot of that too was the governor's own staff. I
was going to ask you a little about that. It sounded like a lot of members of the public had to wait for a few hours to be let into the House, public gallery before the session started.
Yeah. I got there around 9 a.m. and there was already a long line outside of the House gallery, and they had caution tape along some of the rows of seats, and when I tried to go in later, I couldn't go in because they said it was only the governor's staff until 11 a.m. when they would let members of the public in. And so when 11 a.m. hit, about half of the seats were already taken up by governor's staff, secretaries. It was a pretty full crowd, and so the public came in and pretty much all of the seats were taken up.
Yeah, and I did hear some grumblings about that. I had one Republican legislator who told me, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but that they wanted to make sure that someone would be there to cheer on all the governor's initiatives during the speech. So, I think there is some precedent for making sure that special guests and the governor's cabinet secretaries do have seating in there, but it did seem a little more noticeable maybe this year than in some past years.
Yeah, and a governor's spokesperson did say, everybody's here to show their support. It's the governor's last 60-day session, but it is interesting because in other years, they're down on the floor. There's not maybe quite as many, and so they have room to squeeze them onto the floor. But we saw other notable guests, too, like Deb Haaland made an appearance, got a lot of applause.
Yeah, she got, I think, one of the loudest rounds of applause of any dignitaries who were introduced. Obviously, she just left her job as Interior Secretary this weekend, so already back in New Mexico, and I think that'll only kind of fan the flames of speculation about whether she might be running for governor. We'll find that out, in the coming months. But yeah, there were a lot of other tribal leaders there, mayors, state officials. So it's always kind of a who's who of New Mexico politics on the opening day of a session.
Yeah, who can you spot? It's like, where's Waldo?
And now that we've, gone through this first day, kind of moving into the meat and bones of the session, what are you kind of keeping an eye on for, the next few days and the rest of this week?
Yeah, the rest of this week will be interesting because it's going to be a lot of organization, a lot of bill introduction. So we'll see, of course, what kind of bills are getting introduced. I think it'll be interesting to see some of the governor's priorities getting introduced, like the CYFD oversight agencies or some of her crime priorities. And then in opposition to that, if it comes, Republicans introducing kind of bills with the same end goal, but in a different way to do it. Like I mentioned before in their conference, they agree that crime and CYFD are an issue, but they don't think the solution is adding more government programs or addressing behavioral health as like the true root cause of crime.
Yeah, and I think the devil's always in the details. We'll see once these bills are filed, how the specific wording and the language, and then kind of start getting into those debates. A lot of bills were pre-filed, but how it works at the session for anyone who doesn't know is they still need to read in each bill, and actually have it printed, and then they assign it to a committee. So we're kind of keeping an eye on that. If it's just assigned to one or two committees, that's usually a good sign. If it gets 3 or more committee referrals, it's a trickier path. It's not impossible, but that's a big part too. It's just listening to which committees these bills are assigned to try to get a sense of, their path to getting to the floor. And even though 60 days seems like a long time, some of these bills start, there gets to be a backlog in certain committees. So I think there is some strategy there for wanting to get the hearings on the bills early in the session and get them moving a little bit.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about before, the Democratic majority really controls what bills are going to be heard in committee. And you listened in on the new committee chairs that we're seeing this year, right?
Yeah, that was something we were tracking yesterday as well. They did announce new committee chairs because of some of the election results last year and some resignations and retirements. We knew that there was going to be a couple new committee chairs that had to be named, but ended up being 5 new committee chairs, 3 in the House, 2 in the Senate, and then 1 committee chairwoman, Representative Cristina Ortez of Taos, was shifted from one committee to the House Agriculture Committee, which she'll now lead. At least in a few cases, though, the previous chairs said they were okay with not being reappointed as chairs because they had wanted to be appointed to either the Senate Finance Committee or the House Appropriations and Finance Committee. And there are some rules about, that you can, if you're on those budget committees, you can't be the chair of a separate committee. And also if you're in a leadership position, you can't chair a committee. But some of that can sound arcane, but committee chairs are important in the Roundhouse because they schedule when bills are going to be debated. And, sometimes they have the prerogative to not even schedule a certain bill for hearing during their committee. So they have a fair amount of authority to kind of set the agenda for bills that are, in their domain.
Yeah, and one of those bills that Senate Republican leadership brought up is the medical malpractice program that the governor mentioned in her speech. And she didn't really get into details about what exactly it would be, right? But she did mention that insurance costs are just too high and it's driving doctors away. And it's something we've heard from the House Republicans that they think that insurance caps should be lower and that's how we get practitioners to stay here. But the Democrats really don't agree on that. They think it would cause unintended consequences and it would really harm New Mexicans. And that's one of the things Senate Republicans brought up yesterday was, we want to see that happen, but are the Democrats even going to let that get heard in committee?
Right. And I know Republicans have complained about some bills like school choice bills, not even being heard in the respective education committees. And so already kind of that lobbying behind the scenes to try to get at least a hearing for these bills, even if they don't end up passing through a committee. But, we've seen a few attempts in past years to what they call blast a bill out of committee onto the floor, but usually that's not successful. So the typical process is you need to get your bill heard in the committee, need to get it approved and onto the next committee before it can make it to the floor for, a final vote.
Yeah. And I think maybe one other big thing we should talk about here is housing and homelessness that the governor addressed in her speech. And was it 50 million that she wanted to allocate for homelessness?
Yeah, the governor's requested 50 million for homelessness, and we're still kind of, yet to be seen exactly how that money would be spent. She also talked about, some more affordable housing, either for people who are homeless or individuals released from prison who are kind of trying to get back on their feet. So, I think there might be some bipartisan cooperation on those bills or some agreement between the governor and legislators. But as always, once they get into details, and I think the legislature will want to know a lot more exactly how will this money be spent, what kind of guardrails would be attached to making sure it's spent effectively and efficiently and things like that. But certainly I think there's agreement that housing and homelessness is a big issue in New Mexico, and to a certain degree kind of ties into some of the public safety issues as well.
Yeah. And one of the complaints from Republicans too is, again, that these are issues, but we can't just throw money at everything and it's going to solve them. They're kind of looking for more concrete solutions, and like you said, the devil's in the details.
Yeah. So I think, the rest of this week might be a lot of bill introduction, not a lot of bills yet being heard in committee. So now we kind of wait till these bills kind of, and I would think by next week we'll really start hearing committee hearings on bills. And it sounds like some of them could move more quickly than usual in a 60-day session. I know the legislature has said that the Senate has a package of behavioral health bills, and in the House, kind of some criminal competency bills. We're expecting a committee hearing in House Judiciary that'll featuring some judges and some Supreme Court justices talking about this assisted outpatient treatment issue that's gotten a lot of attention. So I would say, we need to get a little rest for the next few days, and next week it's going to really start heating up at the Roundhouse. Yeah.
Well, I'm excited.
And I wanted to thank you too for bringing some cookies and other goodies to help us get through the opening day yesterday. That I'm not sure I would have gotten through the day without some of that.
Yeah, my first stop was the cafeteria to get a breakfast burrito and a coffee. It was much needed. Especially it was so cold yesterday too. We're lucky our photographer didn't freeze up taking photos outside.
Yeah, no, it was a frigid day for opening day. A little bit warmer today, so I think we'll start we survived the opening day, the weather, the crowds, the lack of healthy food, but on to the next day, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how these next few weeks play out.
Yes, it will be.
Well, thanks for joining us. Be sure to keep an eye out for another episode coming out later this week. And what else do you have to add, Megan?
Just keep an eye out. We post these on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and we're excited to keep bringing you more legislative news as the session continues on.
Thanks for joining. I'm Dan Boyd.
And I'm Megan Gleason. This has been Rounding Up the Roundhouse.